Alright, thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to be talking about out-of-body experiences. Now, this project ended up being a bit of a surprise to me. When I started this out, I was looking at out-of-body experiences as a kind of a test case and a way of expanding some theories of body representation that I've been developing. But I wanted to, at the start of the project, get clear on what my explanatory target was going to be, so I was trying to have a look at what's really going on in out-of-body experiences. And what I found when I was doing that was that it was incredibly hard to tell what people were really experiencing and what they were confabulating, what they were saying, to try and make sense of their experiences to themselves. This reminded me of a couple of things. It reminded me of Dennett on dreams, and it reminded me of Dennett on consciousness more generally, and the old Stalinesque versus Orwellian revisions. And so I went back and looked at that and found that the sorts of problems I was having differentiating these options were very similar to what Dennett was saying were the problems for telling apart Stalinesque and Orwellian revisions. So where I've gotten up to with this is not a well-defined description of out-of-body experiences that I can test the theory of body representation against, but rather taking us back to the future, so to speak, to Dennett's old statement arguing for a broadly functionalist account of consciousness. Now, this was a bit of a surprise to me. I didn't think I was ever going to end up a functionalist about consciousness or to believe that it was a realistic possibility, but you go where the arguments take you, and this is where I am. Okay. So the first question is, what is it like to have an out-of-body experience? This is usually defined as an experience in which the subject or the centre of consciousness or the mind seems to be somehow separate from the body, and that the subject can see their body from their external point of view. And this is sort of backed up by some fairly typical examples. I'll read you one. I was standing before a small audience, not more than 10 people, in a well-lit college classroom, delivering a speech which was so well prepared that I could nearly recite it like a memorised poem. Without prior warning, I suddenly had the clear impression of observing myself from the outside, from a position more than a metre above my head and somewhat to the side, near the ceiling of the room. This impression probably did not persist for more than 15 seconds, but for that time it was as though my body was down below the real me, continuing the prepared speech while I was watching from above. And this is the kind of report that you get all the time. In fact, this particular report, if you've ever read a paper on out-of-body experiences, you've probably read that report. Alright, so what I'm going to suggest is that this kind of definition of feeling to be external to your body and of seeing your body is, in a way, too narrow. It doesn't allow us to define every instance which seems to be an out-of-body experience as an out-of-body experience. And it glosses over some of the more important individual variations in the experience, which is what are going to do all the argumentative work for me later on. Alright, so let's have a look at just a couple of reports of some out-of-body experience which seem to describe a richer kind of experience than what we got in our first case. Alright. When asked to do, this is another report this is another report written from the doctor's point of view. When asked to describe what he meant by his body feeling empty, he said, "It was a feeling like a part of me was missing, and this would move from my chest up to my head." He said he would then feel as though he were ascending to the corner of the room, similar to the first case. From there, he could look down at his body while feeling very cold and lightheaded. The body below lay motionless on the floor or bed, while the mind above, that's the patient's words, Could move around the house and see other family members in various rooms. He clearly saw the body below. It was not transparent and did not cast a shadow. The body was dressed in the same clothes he was wearing, but curiously always had combed hair, even when he knew his hair was uncombed before the onset of the episode. He felt that the mind above and the body below shared thoughts, feelings, kinesthesia, feelings of movement, although in some unexplainable way, they both took up separate physical spaces. So what we're starting to see here is cases of out-of-body experiences where there are more features. Here, what I'm particularly interested in is this experience of travelling away from the body. We also see quite a lot of variation, and I'll get to some numbers on this in a minute. We also see quite a lot of variation in what the subject who's external to the body is taken to feel like. I'll go through all of the cases before, but I'll just, all of the sorts of variations in a minute, but I'll just read you one more report, and this will be the end of my phenomenological readings. Again, if you've read anything on out-of-body experiences, you've probably read this report as well. The next thing I knew, I was floating just below the ceiling. I could see myself lying there. I wasn't scared, it was too interesting. I saw myself jerking and overheard my boss telling someone to punch the time card out, and that she was going to take me to the hospital. Next thing, I was in space and I could see Earth. I felt a hand on my left shoulder, and when I went to turn around, I couldn't. Then I looked down and I had no legs. I just saw stars. I stayed there for a while until some inner voice told me to go back to my body. I didn't want to go because it was gorgeous up there. It was warm, not like heat, but security. Next thing, I woke up in the emergency room. Again, we're seeing a lot in this report. I don't want to talk so much about the emotional experiences that the subject is having, although I think they're really interesting and probably related to any functional of out-of-body experiences if there is one. But what I am interested in here is this experience, apparently, of being up above the earth, quite a long way from the body. This is starting to stretch our initial definition of looking back and seeing the body. But also that the subject here seems, when she looks down and just sees stars, she seems surprised that she doesn't have legs, as though she's expected to be a body up there, rather than just a subjective point or a point of view or something like that. Okay, so I think those reports start to give us a bit of a sense of how rich these experiences can be. And so what we have seen, starting as early as the 1980s, was attempts to try and quantify the variation in these reports. And Blackmore did a very good early survey. It wasn't the first one, but I think that it does cover the richness better than the earlier surveys. Now, I'm just going to read you some numbers about what people say their experiences were like. So, in her survey, she found that about 12% of her respondents reported an out-of-body experience. I think she had about 1,500 responses, though I don't have a note on that, my apologies. Of those who did have an out-of-body experience, 44% described it as like being sober and awake, 12% as though they were intoxicated in some way. Interestingly, more of them were actually intoxicated during the experience than said that it was like being intoxicated, so that came out as 18%. Others felt that the experience was dreamlike, which is a bit surprising. Sometimes out-of-body experiences are defined as being like being awake. 44% had this experience of travel, which I think is a really interesting kind of experience. But the visual experience was notably variable. 46% didn't see their body at all. 8% tried to see it but couldn't find it. 24% reported that they saw their body and it looked like their body as they thought it was at that time. And 80% reported seeing their body but looking somehow different. Now, that can be as we saw in the earlier example, something like, I know my hair isn't brushed, but it looks brushed. But there are other reports which suggest that this can be as strong as gender differences. So a male subject seeing, in this case, two female bodies and still identifying with them. Okay, the experience of the subject separate from the body, also quite a lot of variation there. 69% report that they experience a complete second body, 12% that they seem to be just a point in space, 3% in a body which is different from their real body. I take it that covers cases where the subject seems to be embodied but not have legs and so on as well, and 3% in a spatially extended but non-bodily shaped object. This kind of variation, particularly with the visual experience, we're seeing replicated in more recent studies. So Cheney and Girard did a really good study of out-of-body experiences during sleep paralysis. They found was that 51% of their sample who experienced an OBE did not see their own body. And in fact, what's the numbers on this? I think it is, I didn't highlight it. There was, I think it was slightly less than a quarter who had no visual experiences at all during the reported out-of-body experience. Okay. Now, I think that's enough to give us a sense of the variation in these experiences. So what I'd like to move on to, for the sake of time, is how I think that we can describe these cases. So the only thing which seems to be in common to every out-of-body experience as reported is the experience of a subject being separate to the body. Nothing else seems to carry across every case. Some people see themselves, some people don't. Some people travel great distances, others don't. There's variation within the autoscopy, within the self-seeing. And there's quite a lot of variation in the stories that people tell about their travel. Some say they're going just around the house, some to outer space. Thomas Metzinger in his pop books reports that when he was having an out-of-body experience, he went over to Frankfurt, I assume from Mainz, just to look around the city or some such. Other people sort of go to a field next door, or they're just above the street. But these don't make up a majority of cases, and neither does even self-seeing. So what we have, I think, is a kind of a core phenomenology which we can be pretty confident that everyone has. I feel as though I am out there and my body has been left behind. Everything else, there's a question of, do we want to explain it in the same way as that core phenomenology? Alright, so I'm going to try and motivate two different hypotheses about the relationship between what I'm calling the core phenomenology and the rest of the narrative that we get from subjects. And I'm going to use this, do this using Dennett's method of heterophenomenology. So heterophenomenology is the set of methods that we use to study consciousness. It's pretty much what we've been doing already. You take some sort of report, be it a button press, a questionnaire report, or an extended narrative. It's the latter two which have been of interest to us here, as evidence that a subject is having some kind of experience. This was a method that is developed in reaction to what Dennett calls the first person plural, where some notable philosopher talks about what it's like to see a red patch on a wall or a speckled hen and then invites you to agree that you would have the same experience. Now, I don't know what you guys are like. I find that pretty hard. I've never seen, as far as I know, a red patch on a wall or a speckled hen. So whether or not I agree with them when they're talking about this, I really can't tell. But that sort of approach is notable for failures to find consistent agreement. And so what Dennett is trying to do with heterophenomenology and you know, classing these together as a single thing is to, this set of methods as a single thing, is to build a way of operationalizing experience that isn't going to lead to the kinds of disagreements that you get with the first person plural. Alright, so what do we do when we take a heterophenomenological approach? Well, we do what we've been doing. We take the report as an operalization of the experience. So I think, I'll give you one other example from a different area. You know, if a subject answers with a score of 5 or higher on a 7-point scale to the questions, it seemed as if I were feeling the touch of a paintbrush in the location where I saw the rubber hand. It seemed as though I felt the touch I felt was caused by the paintbrush touching the rubber hand, or I felt as if the rubber hand were my hand. Then, if people strongly agree with these statements, then we can be pretty confident that they experience a rubber hand illusion. But we can also, in that case, build in a bunch of control questions. You know, we can add in questions like, I felt as though I had 2 hands, or I felt, 2 right hands, or I felt as though my hand were moving in space. Because we don't think subjects should have this experience during the rubber hand illusion, we can use that as a control and look for differences between the control questions and the test questions as evidence for experience. But we can't do that so easily with the extended narrative approach that we apply to out-of-body experiences. So we run into a problem, and it's not unique to out-of-body experiences by any means. It's a general problem in measuring consciousness. But the reports that we get from subjects need to be interpreted in some way. And this interpretation is never going to be straightforward because the reports might be biased by any number of factors, and they themselves are going to be interpretations of the experience that the subject is giving us. Because you can't directly communicate the experience, you have to translate it into words in order to get it out. Alright. So these sorts of concerns, I agree with Dennett, motivate us to take a kind of neutral approach to the truth of phenomenological reports from subjects. We can say that the subject has absolute authority over their report in the sense that they get to tell us what it is, but we cannot guarantee from that that they experience every feature that they tell us about. And that is because of this process of interpretation. So what we're going to do is treat the narratives as a kind of hypothesis put forward by the subjects about their own experience. Okay. Don't need to worry about report clustering. Alright, so I'm going to use this to set a first hypothesis about the relationship between the core phenomenology and the elaborated phenomenology. The kinds of experiences that we're really confident, or that we can be really confident occur in cases of out-of-body experiences, is this core phenomenology. That's the experience that everyone who reports it seems to have. But these other kinds of experiences, even self-seeing, but certainly these things like suddenly being in outer space or travelling around the house, travelling to Frankfurt and so on, Okay, so these kinds of additions then are on this hypothesis to be understood as confabulations to the experience. Everyone has the core phenomenology, but all of this stuff, the individual variation, they don't really experience that. They just tell a story to make sense about it. So when the subject says that she's floating up above the earth and she looks down and sees stars in place of her legs, we can say that she is wrong. So that's our first hypothesis. The second hypothesis is that the individual difference, the variation, is not just in this confabulatory attempt to make sense of the experience, but in the experience itself. So everyone has different experiences, they're rich, they're detailed, and our account of out-of-body experiences must explain these differences in reports at the experiential level. Okay. Now, these sure seem like they should be different things. I mean, they sound like completely different hypotheses, but it seems to me, and maybe you can think of other experiments that I haven't, but that there is no way to distinguish these hypotheses based on any current or future empirical fact. Okay, so this argument I'm going to take largely from Dennett about Orwellian versus Stalin-esque revisions. I'm going to suggest that our first hypothesis, that there is core phenomenology followed by quite a lot of sense-making which isn't really experienced, it's just the story the subject tells, somewhat reminiscent of what Dennett calls Orwellian revisions, which is the case where phenomenology is revised after it is experienced. Whereas the second hypothesis, that there's all this variation in the experience itself, is reminiscent of a Stalin-esque revision, where we would think that the what becomes the core phenomenology is represented first, and then elaborated, and then the subject experiences it. All right. So far as I can see, there are three potential sources of evidence that we might use to try and distinguish these hypotheses. Either we can look for indirect evidence by considering how out-of-body experiences are constructed. We can look for more direct evidence in subjects' reports about their experience, or we can look for indirect evidence in some kind of futuristic brain scanning of the subject. So let's take these in turn. So one reason we might want to lean towards a view on which out-of-body experiences are constituted by a core experience with the remainder of the reports to be explained in confabulation is the extent to which out-of-body experiences seem to depend on the prior knowledge and commitments of subjects. So we see some interesting correlations. People with out-of-body experiences are more dissatisfied with their bodies and more anxious about their appearance to others than people who don't have out-of-body experiences. Overny et al. Report one subject who had repeated out-of-body experiences induced by marijuana use, who was significantly better at mental rotation of body images than non-out-of-body experiences. People who have these experiences are significantly more likely to believe in life after death, extrasensory perception, and the like than non-out-of-body experiences are. So we might think that these kinds of either skills or beliefs about the rest of the world and about their bodies in particular influence the way in which people with out-of-body experiences tell stories about their experience. Now, so this might lead us to a view on which the first hypothesis, the more Orwellian hypothesis, seems to be justified. But I don't think that we have any good reason to really take that side. Because first of all of this data is correlational. It doesn't tell you whether having these kinds of beliefs makes it more likely you'll have an out-of-body experience, or whether having an out-of-body experience makes it more likely that you'll have these beliefs. And there is some evidence of the second option. You know, a lot of people who have out-of-body experiences report that their beliefs in life after death change after they have the experience. But despite this, you know, I don't think that means we should take the second option and say that something like these beliefs or these skills or these anxieties contribute to experience rather than storytelling. I don't think that it provides evidence that way either, because whichever option we take here, both hypotheses need some further account about how these beliefs, skills, anxieties contribute to either the construction of a confabulative narrative or the construction of experience. I think both hypotheses are on equal ground with this data. So perhaps it would be more helpful for us to look closely at the reports subjects give under more controlled circumstances, where we don't have time for things like memories or memory bias or memory loss or something to influence. How much time have I got?
5 minutes.
Okay, cool. Should be done by then. Alright, so we might think that if we take a laboratory induction of an out-of-body experience and listen to the reports there, that gives us a more clear-cut picture of what these experiences are really like, as distinct from the stories that subjects tell about them. But unfortunately, I think that both of our hypotheses are equally consistent with what we get to date in these kinds of laboratory reports. But also, they're both equally consistent with the counterfactual that subjects reported the opposite of what they actually said. So let's take the real case first. So it does seem that when we induce these experiences with, in particular, TMS, that there are, at least so far as I know, any cases where subjects report travelling away from the body in these immediate induction cases. There are, however, cases of autoscopy, so of self-seeing, but these involve and these involve differences in how the seen body appears. It can be quite realistic, or it can be very different. One subject reports that whatever part of her body she seemed to pay attention to, its size would change. Now, that last case I think is pretty interesting. That sounds like a more elaborated kind of experience than the core phenomenology allows for. So this would seem to push us to the second option, the elaborate experience, or the Stalin-esque option. But the advocate of the more Orwellian approach, that just experience a core phenomenology approach, all they have to say is, well, how do you know when that the subject is having this experience? Well, the way you know it is that you ask them. You ask them to describe it. You say, what's happening? And so all they have to do is propose that probe from the experimenter invites the subject to make sense of their experience, to interpret it, to tell a story about it. And they can still say that the elaboration beyond the core phenomenology is built in at that point. Alright, so let's suppose that it had turned out that whenever OBEs, out-of-body experiences, were induced, that subjects only reported the core phenomenology. this isn't the case, but as we've seen, both our hypotheses are consistent with what is the case, so let's consider the counterfactual. Would it have been possible to tell these hypotheses apart had the world turned out differently? Well, we might think that if subjects only ever reported the core phenomenology, that gives us good grounds to go for our first hypothesis, to go for the Orwellian one. But using the same resources that the Orwellian used for the real case, the Stalinesque advocate, the rich experience advocate can account for this possibility. All they have to do is suggest that when the experimenter probes and asks the subject about their experience, that they probe too soon, and so fix the content of the experience too early before it has a chance to be elaborated. But that doesn't mean that were an elaboration to take place, that it would be unconscious storytelling. It can still be an elaboration in experience. So I don't think that just by controlling these experiences more, we're going to be able to tell these hypotheses apart. So let's take a further step of imagination and imagine a time when neuroscience is good. Sorry, everyone who's in neuroscience. And let's imagine some super high resolution in time and space brain scanner that can tell us where particular mental contents are tokened in the brain, where and when. Now, could we use this to distinguish our storytelling versus experience hypotheses? I don't think we can. And again, this argument comes largely from Dennett on Stalinesque and Orwellian revisions. I don't think we can because I think that both our hypotheses largely agree about what is going on in the brain. Or rather, that they precisely agree about what is going on in the brain. So both take it that the subject represents themselves as separate from their body. This is common to every out-of-body experience case. The question is, when it's elaborated, does the elaboration occur before or after this core phenomenology becomes experienced? Well, suppose we could identify a particular pattern of activity that is the vehicle representing this, what becomes this core phenomenology. The first time we see this vehicle occur in our super brain scanner, we can say, there's the content. That's when they're representing it. But what we can't do is say that they're experiencing it then, unless we're just going to declare that you can never represent this content without experiencing it, which would be surprising, because everything else seems to be possible to represent unconsciously and consciously. So what we can see in the scanner doesn't tell us when the experience occurs on that end. Perhaps we could look further down the line and see that there's evidence that the subject is forming the intention to say something like, I feel like I have left my body. Now that would seem to be pretty good evidence that they're experiencing it at that point. But it doesn't tell us when this content shifted from being unconsciously represented to when it was being consciously represented. It only tells us that it was experienced. It doesn't give us temporal resolution. Similarly, we might think that elaborations on either hypothesis should occur during this time between the initial tokening of the I am separate from my body and when the report starts. But since we don't have any non-arbitrary way of saying when between we first see that content and when the report starts, of placing a dividing line and saying that's when it's conscious, we don't have any non-arbitrary way of placing the elaboration before or after the consciousness line. So I don't think that there's a realistic possibility of any kind of brain data, even this super imaginary fantasy about, I guess Obama fantasy about what brain scanning tells us. I think that there's any way that even that can tell these hypotheses apart. I think what we're beginning to see is that these hypotheses aren't empirically distinguishable, at least not in any way that I can see. And if that's true, then I don't think we have any real reason to think that they are distinct. That seems a little bit unsatisfactory until we recall that there already are theories of consciousness which predict precisely this state of affairs, and these are functionalist or use theories of consciousness, whereby being, very broadly, being a represented content in the brain isn't sufficient for being conscious on